Brand new season, brand new dawn for Box. And it's lights out and away we go.
Simply lovely.
I was really enjoying that last hit.
Hey guys, welcome back to this week's episode of Box, where we are talking about everything Qatar Grand Prix, which certainly wasn't without its fair share of news and controversy, that's for sure. This week, Maxi Taxi secured his third world championship. Our Australian rookie, Oscar Piastri, won his first sprint race, 2 double papaya podium, unsafe driving conditions, few track limits violations, and tyres with an 18-lap lifespan. Honestly, what didn't the Qatar Grand Prix have? But let's get into it. Starting off, let's dive into race conditions. They were absolutely appalling and posed significant health and safety concerns for the drivers. The extreme heat and the lack of readily available water for them saw many, if not all, drivers suffered adverse reactions throughout the course of the race and post-race. Esteban Ocon reportedly threw up in his helmet on lap 15, which is disgusting. Just have to sit there and deal with that for the rest of the race. Lance Stroll was apparently passing out at points and immediately had to go to an ambulance upon the conclusion of the race and getting out of the car. Fernando Alonso suffered burns to his rear end and at one point begged the Aston Martin pit wall to douse him in water at his next pit stop, which they did not do. Can't blame them, but probably would have been nice for Fernando. Logan Sargent had to retire from the race due to acute heat exposure and severe dehydration. His teammate Alex Albon had to be assisted in Parc Ferme by the Alfa Romeo mechanics because he was so dehydrated he was unable to get out of the car unassisted. Oscar and Max could barely stand while doing their post-race interviews and ended up lying down on the floor or sitting down on the floor in the cool-down room. And on top of all of that, Lando then reported in the media pen after the podium that several drivers had to take themselves to the medical centre and then later passed out in the medical centre. Honestly, in what world is that okay? The FIA they're very quick to delay a race for unsafe driving conditions in the wet. But why don't they do anything in the heat? It's the same premise. And yes, they have since come out and said that they will be looking into it and taking action so that it never happens again and that the drivers never have to put themselves into that extreme situation ever again. But why is it always done after the fact? The FIA are well aware of how hot it gets in the cockpit of an F1 car at the best of times. But combine that with the high air temperature, the high humidity. Why did no one have the foresight in that paddock to say, hey, these may not be the right conditions to drive in today, and postpone the race at least a couple of hours or until such time as the conditions would be safe to drive in? And driver safety should always be the priority in every circumstance, but for some reason was disregarded entirely by the FIA in Qatar. I mean, they cared more about the freaking tyre life than they did the drivers, but we'll come back to that. Moving on, let's talk track limits, because yet again, they have reared their heads. But at least the FIA were consistent for once. But the string of lap time deletions across qualifying, the sprint shootout, the sprint race, and the Grand Prix itself caused absolute chaos and was made worse after the white lines in turns 12 and 13 were moved inwards, shrunk, due to the tyres and the curbs not being friends. But this also posed an issue because that was the corner with the most amount of offences of track limits prior to the change. It was also made worse after the change. And then, on top of all of that, some deletions and penalties were handed out up to 2 hours after the race. Lando found out about his deletion in Parc Ferme for qualifying. Oscar found out on live television. Charles was then dropped out of the points in the sprint well and truly after the conclusion because of time penalties that he sustained. And then in the Grand Prix, Gasly, Albon, Stroll and Perez were all handed 1 or more 5-second penalties and sent the final classification, into a freefall, with drivers not knowing their final position until the FIA released the final classification a few hours after the end of the race, when they'd reviewed everything and handed out everyone's penalties. The frustrations and the logistical issues that this poses on the teams, drivers and the FIA has put the future of the Qatar Grand Prix in jeopardy. Yes, that's right. The logistical challenges posed by track limits is what has put the future of the Qatar Grand Prix in jeopardy. Not the fact that drivers were losing consciousness at the wheel or passing out from acute heat exposure and severe dehydration. God forbid we make the FIA's lives difficult. But in all seriousness, track limits are becoming an issue. It's not just Qatar that is at risk. If the FIA can't come up with a solution, Austria is also on the chopping block, given the amount of issues we saw there this year and last year. So FIA, may I suggest that we put a tyre barrier, a wall, instead of a runoff. So, they physically cannot go wide in those corners or sections of the track, because you know, it's not as big of an issue on street tracks where there's walls. So if we put the walls on the track, anyway, my 2 cents. Let's move on. Pirelli tyres. This week, I learned a lot about tyres. How the construction of tyres, the makeup of tyres, the destruction of tyres. I learned a lot about tyres against my will. But Pirelli tyres, no matter what compound, are incapable of driving more than 18 laps over the pyramid curbing in Losail without calling it a day. And while this did pose a few issues here and there, I actually think it added a little something. It added a little bit of spice, some zest, if you will, given that the spectators and the strategists up and down the pit lane knew exactly when their rivals had to pit, as well as their own. And it also allowed the drivers to go all out for longer periods and not have to worry about preserving their tyres as much. So overall, I actually think it added to the quality of the race. I mean, the gap to the Red Bull out the front was the shortest we've seen all season. And I'm going to give some credit to McLaren there as well, because they've developed the car. But, you know, it added a little something. And I'm all here for it. So I fully support the suggestion for this to be implemented in more Grand Prix, just so we can get maybe not a Red Bull win. Actually, I'm just going to say Max win, because let's be honest. Anyway, speaking of Red Bull, they once again had a very, very mixed weekend. Maxi Taxi officially claimed this year's Driver Championship, so congratulations to him again. But meanwhile, Perez couldn't really get out of Q2. He crashed out of the sprint, albeit it wasn't his fault, and he couldn't keep the car within the white line, and subsequently received multiple time penalties, seeing him finish in 10th spot. Not what you want on a weekend where you're trying to prevent your teammate from securing the Drivers' Championship. And the amount of track limits violations that man received is a very, very stark contrast to his winning teammate that received absolutely no track limits violations whatsoever. And as if that wasn't bad enough, reports from the paddock this week for Checo is that he's been given a warning about his performance by Christian and Helmut. He's been advised that he needs to get back to his early season form quickly or risk losing his seat in 2024. I believe he was told that if he doesn't secure P2 in the championship, meaning he can no longer be outscored by Lewis, then he's out and Danny's in. And interestingly enough, and I'd like to give a shout out to FanAmp for this one, rumour has it Checo is set to announce his retirement at the Mexico Grand Prix in a few weeks' time, after reportedly being told by Red Bull at the Japanese Grand Prix that they would not be honouring his 2024 contract and that he should start looking elsewhere. So there are some conflicting reports about what's been said, all of that. But the consensus is Checo's time is limited. Either he's going to be booted or he's going to leave of his free will. Or he's been booted and is leaving of his own free will. And given that he has struggled so much this season in a championship winning car to be competitive and be up there every single week with his teammate, even if he is let go by Red Bull, it's unlikely that any of the other top teams are going to unseat one of their drivers to put him in. Except for maybe Aston Martin, given Lance Stroll's situation. So really, his only hopes are the bottom teams. And given that they have largely all confirmed their driver lineups for next year, his only hope would therefore be the remaining Williams seat. I guess he may retire rather than move to a less competitive team. But either way, he'd still be in the midfield. Let's be honest. And even if Red Bull promoted Danny from AlphaTauri to fill that seat, it's unlikely that they would choose Checo to fill the empty seat at AlphaTauri, given the incredible performances of Liam Lawson of late. I guess Mexico is going to be a bit interesting. Spice coming out of Mexico. But on to Mercedes. Again, a team that had a very mixed weekend. I saw that a lot this weekend. Very, very up and down for a lot of teams. But anyway, after qualifying second and third for the Grand Prix, things kind of fell apart in the sprint shootout, where Lewis Hamilton qualified 12th, but George managed 4th. They did come back for a 4 and 5 finish, respectively. So overall, an improvement, but neither driver really appeared to struggle with track limits. So that's something. But Sunday's race was their downfall, especially when your 7-time world championship driver breaks the cardinal rule of racing and wipes out his teammate into turn 1 of lap 1. Seeing him retire from the race and George have to claw his way back up the order to come home 4th. I mean, which is no small feat, given the conditions and the issues with the tyres and everything. But still not ideal. However, I do aspire to be as delusional as George Russell, given that he thought that he may have had a chance to pull one over on Max and win had his teammate not taken him out. I'm here for the confidence and the belief in the team and the car, but Georgie, there was absolutely nothing stopping Max from winning that race, except if Lewis had wiped him out instead, in a little throwback to 2021. But on another note, their team dynamic was once again making headlines, with both drivers hopping on the radio after their little bingle, to express their disdain with the other one and blaming each other for the incident and ruining the other's race. So much so that Toto had to hop on the radio from home to remind George of the task at hand. And even though Lewis took accountability after the race and apologised to George and the team, posting pictures of them hugging it out, I don't know if I believe that everything's okay behind closed doors, as it very much seemed like a staged PR move. Like, if Lewis is going to go up to George and give him a hug and be like, sorry mate, why do you need cameras there? It's very much giving nothing to see here, everything's fine, everyone move along, nothing to talk about. But I guess time will tell, but could this be developing into another Hamilton-Rosberg situation from 2016? I mean, I hope not. But Ferrari. I said last week I wanted to be wowed, and I guess that's on me for not specifying that I wanted to be wowed in a good way. I wanted them to blow my mind. I set the bar too low. They wowed me in a very bad way. I mean, their weekend did start off well. They started with a 2-3 in practice, and then they went steeply off a cliff from there. Charles got his car into Q3 and qualified 5th for Sunday's GP, while Carlos was unable to get his car out of Q2 and qualified 12th. I don't believe there was any track limits violations there, he just struggled with the car. Things then seemed to improve slightly for the sprint shootout, where they qualified 5th and 6th, only Carlos able to maintain a points finish with 6 in the sprint race, with Charles being demoted due to his 5-second time penalty. Thank you, FIA. And then the tables turned on their steep decline once again, when Carlos was ruled out of Sunday's Grand Prix altogether due to a fuel system error that they were unable to fix. And so Charles came home with a 5th place finish and 10 points. So I mean, technically both drivers scored points this weekend, just in 2 different races. So that's something. And the pit crew did manage a PB of the season with a 1.92 second pit, which is a miracle in itself. And their race strategy wasn't completely questionable, but I'm putting that down to Carlos Hot Chili Pepper Sainz being in the garage to keep everyone in check and do the strategy work for them. I mean, he does it anyway, but it's nice he didn't have to battle the car, other drivers, heat exhaustion and dehydration while doing it this week. Either way, it would have been better than what the pit wall could come up with. Aston Martin. What a mid-weekend. The most entertaining thing that Aston Martin did was having Lance Stroll lose it with his personal trainer, shove him into a wall after yet another appalling qualifying session, and then become the subject of an FIA review because of that. And then the Fernando asking the pit wall to douse him in water at his next pit stop. That was funny. It was sad, but it was funny. On to their performance. Alonso did manage another Q3 performance this week, while Stroll was again knocked out in Q1. Both drivers replicating their Grand Prix qualifying form into the sprint shootout, Alonso qualifying 9th and Stroll 16th. Alonso continued to carry the team on his back in both the sprint and the Grand Prix, scoring points in both outings, while Stroll continues his streak of not scoring a single point since the summer break. And while I previously had hope that they would be able to claw back some of their early season form, that ain't gonna happen. The gap to Ferrari has been extended. McLaren are now only 11 points behind. I wouldn't be surprised if we see them lose their 4th place position next time out in Austin, given that it's another sprint and another Grand Prix weekend. McLaren are on a roll, and Aston Martin's got one capable driver. So let's talk about McLaren. What a weekend. I'm actually still in shock and disbelief. And I've only recently stopped crying the happy tears. Tearing up again, thinking about it. After a rough qualifying for both Lando and Oscar, both drivers losing out on their P2 and P3 positions for track limits violations, seeing them start 10th and 6th respectively. They came back with a vengeance, and I am here for it. The sprint shootout saw a papaya front row, with OP taking pole for the first time. And well, you know the existential crisis I mentioned last week? I had an existential crisis this week when I thought of the possibility that Oscar may get his maiden win before Lando. Yeah, that one. Well, it happened. Our little Aussie rookie took out his first win before little Landini, and I was overwhelmed with emotion. I sobbed uncontrollably at 5 o'clock in the morning out of sheer happiness for Oscar, and then devastation for Len, for being beaten to a win by yet another Australian teammate. Even though he did come home at 3rd behind Maxi Taxi himself. But we all know his time will come, and I feel like it'll be sooner rather than later, especially given his performance on Sunday. Shout out to OP for coming home in 2nd place, and to Lando for yet another podium. To go from 6th and 10th to a podium in those conditions is absolutely phenomenal. And in the words of Oscar Piastri,
Thank you, Mercedes.
for allowing that to happen. I couldn't be happier for them. And I did cry at 5:30 a.m. about that one too. But that's it's no doubt that they're getting ever closer to the Red Bull and that they have them on their toes, given that the gap between the two and Max was consistently between 4 and 8 seconds for the duration of the race. One of the shortest gaps to Max out in front all season. So once again, props to the drivers, props to the team on those upgrades. It's just absolutely phenomenal. I'm loving it. I just hope that this is a glimpse of what we can expect in 2024. I know Red Bull are a little bit on their toes. Helmet say they're developing their car around the McLarens, given that they're the most consistent team that's close to them at the moment. Alpine. I think it's safe to say that they had a less than desirable weekend. Pierre, he didn't, what are white line? He doesn't know. Esty Bestie threw up in his helmet on lap 15 of 50 something. That is not ideal. The consistency, the smell, all of it. Ugh. Their sprint shootout performances were also not great. Pierre only managed P11, Esteban P10, but they both managed to qualify okay for the Grand Prix, both making Q3 and starting 7th and 8th. Their sprint races were largely mediocre. Neither driver scored points. Pierre finished just outside the points, and Estebesti failed to finish the race altogether after coming together with Perez and Hulkenberg. Thank you for it on the safety car. And things looked like they were improving in the Grand Prix, and that both drivers may score some valuable points, despite the situation in Esty Bestie's helmet. However, track limits got Pierre knocked down to 12th, and then Esteban secured 7th position, and it was a whole thing. Thinking about it makes me feel icky. So moving on, Williams. Another team that had a very rough weekend. Logan finally almost out-qualified Alex. He was beaten by the smallest of margins and started 16th in the Grand Prix. Alex 14th. As for the sprint shootout, neither driver made it out of SQ1. Logan then crashed out of the sprint because he forgot to turn the car. And Alex came home 7th with 2 points. So good job to him. But the GP was rough for both of them. Alex managed to finish the race in 13th, but Logan was unfortunately forced to retire due to the extreme conditions, combined with his flu-like symptoms that he'd been experiencing earlier in the week. And now I want to commend James Vowles, the team principal at Williams, for how he and the team approached this and how they valued their drivers' welfare more than the completion of a race. I mean, granted, okay, Logan wasn't going to score any points, and he was at risk of crashing out of the race and causing them more issues. But that's not the point. For Logan, a rookie at risk of losing his seat because of his undesirable performances of late, to be able to tell the team that he was physically unable to finish the race indicates to me that they have cultivated a nice working environment, a safe working environment for their employees, and that they value them. Something that I don't think a lot of teams or a lot of workplaces in general would do. And I also think it speaks to the relationship that James has with his drivers, given that Logan tried so hard to finish that race, coming on the radio, giving James his word that he could, but he still felt like he could go back to the garage and face him in the wake of not being able to do so. But on a different note, does this also suggest that Logan may have a position within the team for next season? Did he feel as though he could retire because his career was no longer on the line? Or is it purely that Williams have just cultivated an environment where his retirement, due to being unwell in those being in those extreme conditions and having that exacerbated, wouldn't impact on how they viewed him as a driver? But after all, the race was incredibly brutal, and I believe both drivers have said they're taking this week to just recharge, get better before we head to Austin. So props to Williams. They may have had an incredibly rough weekend, but they did something that no other team or the FIA did in Qatar. They gave a shit about their drivers. And that is a win in my books. On to Haas. Again, similar to last week, they weren't really there. Didn't really notice them. I mean, aside from Hulk's little tangle with Ocon and Perez in the sprint, it was a rather uneventful, borderline boring weekend. And K-Mag didn't get out of Q1 and secured a 19th position start. Hulk made it out but qualified 15th. And then K-Mag was also unable to improve in the sprint shootout, again qualifying 19th. Nico managed to get into SQ3 and qualified 7th, but neither driver managed to score any points in the sprint or the Grand Prix, so I can't really imagine that Jean or Gunther were too happy about that. So that's all I'm going to say on Haas. Not really anything more to say. Didn't really achieve much. No news. On to Alfa Romeo. I honestly think this was one of the best weekends that Alfa Romeo have had. Quali for Zhou, it was rough. He qualified 20th. But Valtteri managed to put that piece of crap Alfa Romeo into Q3, which is honestly a miracle. The sprint shootout was a nice in-between, both drivers making it into SQ2. Neither driver was able to score any points in the sprint. Valtteri finished 10th and Zhou finished 14th. They did, however, bring home some great points in the Grand Prix. Both drivers finished in the top 10. Zhou gained an incredible 11 places, which equaled his best finish of the season in 9th, while Valtteri managed his equal best finish of 8th. So props to them both. They did a great job in those tough conditions. I think they like desert tracks because they seem to perform well there. Maybe it's the car, maybe it's the driver, maybe it's a bit of both. Who knows? And last but not least, AlphaTauri. AlphaTauri last week confirmed that the Qatar Grand Prix would be Liam Lawson's last with the team for the moment, and that Danny Rick himself would be back for Austin. So there's a whole range of emotions in there, for me at least. I'm super stoked that Danny's going to be back and making his comeback at his second home of Austin. Some would argue it's his first. No, Melbourne. Austin is second. But I'm sad to see Liam go, given how good he's been in Danny's absence. But nevertheless, let's review his last round for now and Yuki's race too. Liam had a rough quali. He was unable to make it out of Q1 and was out-qualified by Yuki for the fourth time, who qualified in 11th. The roles did reverse for the sprint shootout, however, with Liam managing P14 in his first ever F1 sprint, and Yuki only managed 18. But it wasn't smooth sailing when the lights went out on the sprint. Liam crashed out early on, causing a very early safety car. And then Yuki crossed the line in 11th. And the Grand Prix wasn't much better. Neither driver secured any points. And then Liam finished 17th and Yuki 15th. But props to them both for finishing the race in those shit show of conditions. That in itself is an achievement. And before we welcome Badani back in Austin, let's review the season that has been for little Liam Lawson. After being brought in for the injured Danny Rick in Zandvoort, he has managed to be the second rookie to score points this season, with his highest finish of 9th coming in Singapore, while his lowest GP finish came last weekend in Qatar, where he finished 17th, concluding his run of GPs with an average finishing position of 12th, beating his teammate Yuki Tsunoda on 4 out of 5 occasions. His qualifying performances were equally as impressive, despite only out-qualifying Yuki on 1 occasion. He managed a season high of 10th place in Japan, and his lowest was in Zandvoort, given that was the weekend he first got in the car. So, props to him. Overall, he had a GP average qualifying position of 14, and if we factor in one and only sprint race, his average overall qualifying position remains 14th. Still better than 6 veterans that have been on the grid for a while, and Logan Sargent. 5 veterans, 1 rookie. But his overall average finishing position gets pushed out to 16th. Still better than 4 people. Nevertheless, he does statistically come out as the second best rookie of the season in those 5 races. And thus he's taking out my inaugural award for Best Performing Driver this week. It's like Driver of the Day, but it's chosen by me. A little narcissistic, but we're going with it. Anyway, that has been the wrap-up of the Qatar Grand Prix. The shit show that was. Hopefully next week in next week in Austin, in Texas. Everything's bigger and better in Texas, apparently. It'll be a little less dramatic off-field, a little less extreme conditions, but just as entertaining. So, thank you for listening. Make sure to like, subscribe, all of that fun stuff. And I will see you next week for a little mid-season review and a little Austin preview. So I'll see you then. Bye, guys.